So what we're looking to do is to present information that is sort of hyper-local, literally in your backyard, and then as the series progresses, give you some practical information for things that people living on the South Shore can do right now. Because climate change can sometimes seem like such a big issue, nobody really knows what to do. So, our first presentation is by Martecchini. He is a local guy from Duxbury, but also works for Kleinfelder Associates, and they were the company that produced the study that Andre is going to present for the towns of Marshfield, Duxbury, and Scituate last year. So,
great.
There you go, Andre.
Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, I am a local. I live in Duxbury. Been here for almost 20 years now, and I'm also a trustee of the Duxbury Beach Reservation with Al Wotrina over here. And climate change and sea level rise, which is a component of climate change, is really happening. And we see it on the beach. We're seeing the flooding occurring more and more often. If you talk to Don Beers, our harbor master over in Duxbury, he'll tell you that the docks used to be a lot steeper. More and more, he feels them being flatter and flatter, which mean the ramps. So sea level rise is happening. One of the things that we, as we did this study for the 3 towns, we wanted to stay away from the debate about what is causing sea level rise. There's a lot of debate, is it natural? Is it man-made? Is it a combination of both? Frankly, I think that's a discussion that really doesn't matter, because in the long run, it is happening. So the idea is, let's be honest, let's understand what the impacts are, and then deal with it the best we can. If we can do anything as mankind to try and reduce the impacts, so be it, great. So anyway, so what I'd like to do, we'll talk about the project a little bit. And we'll give a little bit of an overview of what how we did the methodology. We'll talk about some of the inundation modeling, some of the impacts to natural resources, infrastructure, transportation. Emergency access is actually a big issue. We'll talk a little bit about adaptation strategies. Now, as Sarah mentioned, this is the first of I think, 6-part series. What we're going to be focusing here much more is in what sort of set the stage for what can we expect. Some of the later topics are going to be focusing a little bit more on the adaptation. In other words, what do you do to actually adapt to this rising sea level? And then some of the next steps. So, first of all, just the towns of Marshfield and Duxbury and Scituate were not the first people around here worrying about adaptation. Just in our company alone, we're currently working with the city of Cambridge, which is really looking at climate change from a not just sea level rise, because they're not, although they have water, they're worried about water coming over the Charles River Dam into the Charles River. But they're looking at temperature, they're looking at wind impacts, precipitation affecting storm drainage. So they're really taking a very advanced look at the climate change in the big picture. Massport, runs Logan Airport, runs Connolly Terminal, a lot of shipping. They're very worried. They saw what happened in Sandy down to LaGuardia and the shipping facilities down in the New York, New Jersey area. So they are very worried, and they've now commissioned a major study on climate change. And the Army National Guard down at Camp Edwards down on the Cape also was very concerned. And they happen to be a major emergency evacuation area, and so they are very concerned. So the 3 towns that we're talking about, they have had a lot of storm damage. Just last week, I happened to be in Florida on vacation, turned on the news, and I see ice floating around in Scituate. So it's happening all the time now. So from 1978 to 2013, based on the National Flood Insurance Program, the state of Massachusetts had $337 million of claims. we had down here, these 3 towns alone accounted for about 23%, 78 million worth of claims. And Marshfield, 15.9 million, Duxbury 4.7, not as impacted, and certainly Scituate is the most impacted. So this is very real, and the claims are getting more expensive and more frequent. So the primary objectives of this study, first of all, were to try and come up with what are the projected sea level impacts. So before you can talk about adaptation, before you can talk about strategies to deal with it, you got to first understand and come to consensus, which is not easy. And this is something that's very difficult, is to come to a consensus as to what is that design going to be? What are we designing for? So that's the first part. The second part, this was done under a $30,000 grant, so it's not, it may sound like a lot, but it's actually not a lot of money to do all the stuff. The focus was on public education here. We were not focusing on the actual adaptation of the end result. That's going to be the next step. But so part of what we were trying to do is produce some good graphics that people could understand, that the towns could then own, and have the GIS databases that people can come in and look specifically at their, in much more detail. Then we're talking about some adaptation strategies, as well as the whole public outreach. And really this is, although it's not part of the project, but this is part of that public outreach. So let's talk a little bit about some of the methodology. So first step is you got to understand what are the climate projections that we're going to be using. Second is to actually do the modeling. And then third is to look at the adaptation planning itself. Again, what we were really focusing on this project were steps 1 and 2, understanding what the problem is. We sort of touched on some ideas for adaptation strategies, but really that's not the focus of this project yet. So, what's causing sea level rise? Again, without getting into what's causing the Earth to warm and things like that, but the fact is that there are 2 main components that really affect us. One is the global sea level change, and that's being caused by thermal expansion of the ocean. So as the water warms, it expands. Okay, so if you have a container and you warm it, it's going to actually get more volume. And so as the air has warmed over the years, the volume of the ocean is also increasing. In addition, we're adding fresh water from glacier melt. Now here's a picture, unfortunately a little bit, you don't see it very well, but here, this is Glacier Bay in National Park up in Alaska. So the bottom one is 1941. You see this whole area is an entire iceberg. Now in 2004, that iceberg is way up there in the hill there. And now that's all water. So that volume of water, which is happening in Greenland, happening in the Alps, happening everywhere, these glaciers are melting. And so that is a large contribution. The other component, which is a much, much smaller component, is some local sea level changes, and primarily land subsidence. Now, remember, if you remember your geology, land moves. So there are plate tectonics. Sometimes it can move up, sometimes it can move down. Also, for instance, your land compresses. So, we have, for instance, the beach out on Duxbury Beach. As waves move, it actually can compress. So land can actually drop, which in effect causes more area for potential for water. And just to, when you look at, again, this is up in the Arctic. Now, the Northwest Passage, which, many years ago was impassable to shipping. Now it's being able to use for shipping. So to be able to circumnavigate. That is it's a direct example of melting glacier. So now the question is, how do you predict sea level rise? Now, I'm going to be honest, Kleinfelder, my company, we're not climatologists. We're not people that are making the studies of how much sea level is going to rise, what we used for this study is a set of curves developed by NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, as part of what they call the Global Sea Level Rise Scenarios for the United States National Climate Assessment. And it was prepared in 2012. And that has a series of curves. And you can see here, this is where we are today. So up in the from 1900 on, there were some measurements, and the next slide will show that. But this area, if you did nothing, and things happened just as they were for the last 100 years, you can interpolate a line that would do this and be the low line. Things are starting to change, and they are already starting to show movement of more rapid increase in sea level rise. So there were a series of curves that were developed that basically take into account different modeling impacts of glacier melt and temperature warming. So there are a family of curves. Our committee, which was the town project managers, which were the planning directors for all the towns, plus CZM, coastal zone management people, were part of our planning committee for this. The final curve that we are using for planning purposes is the high curve. Okay, and we'll, okay, thank you. The high curve. Part of that was also that when in our Cambridge study that we're working on, we have a lot of academics. You know, Cambridge is the home of some pretty brainy institutions. They think they are, and they are very much participating in the whole development of scenarios and things. And the consensus on that committee was also that the higher curve, in fact, that there's data, modeling data, which is actually showing some even more ominous curves. But we decided to use, for planning purposes, this one. So all of our data is based on that. So if you look at, this is the Boston sea level tide gauge up in Boston Harbor. And again, this is starting, you don't see it here, it's cut off here, but it's from 1900, and again, this is plotting up here. And you can see that, in any given year, you have a lot of variability. But when you look at it, this line here is sloping at about 2.63 millimeters per year of sea level rise. Okay? Now you start seeing it, down here you see this is up, down, up, down, up, down. But now you start seeing there's not a lot of down. It's starting to make a little bit more of a movement up. So if you were to keep going another couple of years, it's probably starting. This is starting to curve. How much it's going to curve? Certainly, you got to keep measuring data over the next 10, 20 years. You're going to start seeing a little bit better patterns. Now, keep in mind this is averaging 2.63 millimeters for the last 100 years or so. So what we did, the project was to look at 3 scenarios. We projected out 3 different years, 25 years, 50 years, and 75 years. So this top line is the contribution from global sea level rise, which is basically taking those curves, that high level curve, it's a mathematical curve, and we can just plot, and for any given year, it's predicting what the amount of sea level rise will be. The second component, remember, was that land subsidence. The way we calculated that, it's also, the land subsidence is a very small component, but the way we did it, if you remember, the Boston gauge is showing a rise in sea level of about 2.63 millimeters per year. The average in this northern Atlantic region outside in the ocean is about 1.6 millimeters per year. So we're attributing that difference to some land subsidence. And so that's this component. So when you add the two of them together, in 25 years from now, the sea level is going to change by about a foot. In 50 years, about 2.8 feet. and in 75 years, 5.16 feet. So that's a lot. And now what that means is your daily tidal elevation, wherever it is today, is going to increase by these amounts according to this modeling scenario. This has nothing to do with storms. This is just the base elevation. So if you think, Pine, if you think you're flooding, just your daily tide is probably going to be close to flooding 75 years from now.
I agree.
Would be at your doorstep in every day. So that is the modeling scenario that we looked at. Now, again, that's straight tide. What we did, because we had a very limited budget, so we had to choose one scenario to look at. So what we're looking at is this, we're modeling mean high water, which is your highest, you have 2 tides a day, it's the higher of the 2, and on that mean. We're not looking at the astronomical tides. Astronomical tides will also be much higher. But from the town's perspective, they were interested in looking at it in planning, for planning purposes, looking at that sort of event that's going to happen every day, not the event that's going to happen, later. If you really want it to be much more accurate, you would look at different scenarios. But then to this is your tide. Now you're adding your storm. Okay, so now you get that nor'easter that blows in. There's a storm surge that comes with it. And basically it's 2 things that cause the storm surge. One is the wall of water that's being pushed, physically is being pushed by the wind, and it tends to, the water in front of it tends to get pushed up. The other thing is storms, hurricanes, nor'easters are low pressure systems. What happens? Low pressure means the pressure gets off and the water literally gets sucked up higher. So the combination of those 2 things creates what's called the storm surge. Now what we're looking at is the mean of that storm surge. We are not looking, because we just don't have the capability in this limited study, to look at the fact that storm surge means that you have waves that have a crest and a trough. So the waves are higher than the mean. So right away, whatever numbers we show in terms of storm surge later on are not going to include the effective waves. It's just the surge, the mean level. In addition, as waves hit land, they tend to run up. Now, for those of you who may be following the controversy, it's controversy, of the FEMA mapping and flood insurance and all of that, the FEMA is taking into account these higher elevations, this wave run up and the actual wave heights themselves in their modeling. However, just to be sure, they are not taking into account sea level rise. So what all they're looking at is, this is today, they're not looking at the fact that in 25 years, that base number is going to be up here, which is the difference of the sea level rise. So that's just something to think about. So to illustrate what that means, in our study, this happens to be a wall in seawall at Wrexham Beach in Marshfield. Now, we had some areas where our modeling showed that there was no flooding behind these walls. And people said, well, that's not realistic. And we said, yes, we know that. Because what happened was, we are modeling sea level rise, and that's where in 75 years the water elevation at mean high water will be at elevation 963. And the current one is somewhere 4 or 5, whatever, I forget what the number was. Then on top of that, we were adding 2.9 feet of storm surge. So that's our storm surge. But now, it just so happens that the top of the wall is at elevation 13. So on a modeling, from a pure computer modeling perspective, it doesn't exceed this wall, and therefore it wasn't flooding behind. The reality is that there's a wave that's coming on top of that surge, and so yes, obviously there's flooding. The storm surge modeling was done by a program called SLOSH, and it basically simulates a You can set it for different parameters. We tried to model as close, it's primarily a hurricane modeling something program. We tried to model closer to a nor'easter, which is really, especially for Marshfield and Scituate, those are the storms that really batter them. The hurricanes, although they can be certainly devastating, the nor'easters are the bigger damage. And then we modeled different speeds and things and tried to get an envelope of what speeds, what the impacts would be. So now, as we get into the modeling, what we started with was a base elevation. The base elevation was done with a LiDAR mapping. So it's a pretty accurate survey mapping done from aerial surveys. So we have the base elevation. Again, that's our mean high water number. We add to the different scenarios the sea level rise component, and then on top of that the storm surge. So when we're saying the inundation depth, and when we show that on drawings, the inundation depth is that total from the top surface down to the ground. Okay? And again, just keep in mind that we have some limitations. We don't want to mislead people. Again, as I said, the storm surge values we're using are not including wave run up and the actual wave heights. The modeling does not. So, for instance, here on the Jones River, we're not looking at the fact that typically in a nor'easter, especially a hurricane, we could very likely have very, very heavy rains coming down, which actually obviously raise the river level, and if it coincides with the tidal impact. So we're not modeling any river components due to rain. We looked at very limited scenarios. So we looked at only mean high water plus the storm surge. You could look at astronomical tides. You could look at low water. You could look at all different kinds of scenarios. And I'll show you this. The 2D, the maps that we show are 2D, and it shows. So for instance, okay, here. So the map shows buildings. You see here, and see, these are all houses from aerial views. And you can see this, and you look and say, "Oh my God, these houses are all flooded." Well, not necessarily, because the only thing that the mapping does, it looks at. So remember, this was that inundation depth, the total depth, and it gets color coded. So from 0 to 2 feet, it's a very light color, and the darker it gets. So this is 2 to 4 feet, 4 to 6 foot, and so on. So the darker the water, the deeper it is, basically. But it doesn't come around and say, that house, which it could be on piles. You think of Hummerock Beach or some of these beachfront homes, Gurnett Road, Marshfield, Ocean Street. A lot of these houses are high up on pilings, on stilts. They may not be flooding. The water may be passing underneath it. We could not, on this type of inundation mapping, we don't take that into account. So, but anyway, that's basically what we're going to look at. So I'll just kind of run through some scenarios. I don't want to, we can certainly talk about them later, and unfortunately the quality of the projector here is not projecting very well, so it's hard to see. But we just looked at Scituate 75-year. This is sea level rise with storms. So this is the worst case, these are the areas that are particularly hit. And the bottom line is that what we found is the areas that are flooding today are really the areas that are going to keep on flooding and getting worse. And there really weren't any major new areas that got opened up. So that's the good news. That whatever is there is basically continuing, but just will be getting worse. This is Marshfield. Let's see. So let's see. Where's Brant Rock? Is down in here somewhere. Where'd it go? It's down over here. And then you have the Hummerock area over here. So, and then you have Duxbury down here. This is all Duxbury Beach. And again, and so you kind of get a general sense.
The Jones River is on that map.
Yes, it is down right here. So we're right here, I think, somewhere right around in there. Yeah. So Now, one thing we're giving this is all done in GIS, global
Information.
no, information systems. I'm trying to think. Geographic information systems, GIS. And so what we're doing is giving all of these maps, all the different scenarios to the town planners, and they can now work with them, and if they need to zero in on that area, and they can look at different scenarios, and so it's actually a good tool for them to work with. So then what we did, and I'll just show you a few of them just to kind of get a feel for some of the more dramatic ones. We went into a couple of specific areas in town that were, the committee sort of came up and said these are sort of the more critical areas. And we went through and sort of did some scenarios. So this is downtown Scituate, the harbor area, Front Street here. So this is sea level rise alone. This is just your daily mean high water. Twice a day, basically you're going to have. So what this is saying, in 25 years, the mean high water is not going to be overtopping the banks, which is good. However, in 75 years, when you have 5.16 more projected feet of water, now twice a day, that water is overtopping the seawall and is in the parking lot and is getting as far as Front Street in some areas. It's low, but this is without any kind of a storm. So now you add a storm to it. Unfortunately, the colors are not coming out very well here, but so now with the storm, now you see this would be if you had a storm at mean high water at 25 years, and then here with 50 years, you're having 2 or 3 feet of water on Front Street. And that's obviously a major problem. And then what we did for some of these critical areas, we modeled with a photo simulation. We took a picture, and then it's actually very accurate because it takes into account the angle and to put in the plane of the surface. So this is the 75-year with the storm and the high tide. So obviously, and now keep in mind, this area does flood even today with if you have a storm surge and high tide, this will be flooding. Certainly not as dramatic as that. This is Brant Rock down in Marshfield. Again, without storm surges, it's in 75 years it starts to get out here. We were concerned about the right over here is the sewer treatment plant, and that one actually works. All of the in both towns, the Scituate and Marshfield, the sewer treatment plants are actually pretty well protected. But now as you get the storm surge, now you really get into some, and this is without the overtopping from the waves and the run-up. So it obviously is going to be pretty dramatic. This is which church? This is Ocean Street over here in 139, where the picture was taken. So you can see it's up a couple of feet on that building there. Then moving to Duxbury, this is the Bluefish River coming. You have up here Washington Street. I'm sorry, Powder Point Avenue over here. No, I'm sorry, Washington Street over here. Bluefish River Bridge. This is the new school. We're building a big new school right here. Luckily, it looks like it's well sited and it's above. Now, in this case, see, this is a limitation. As an example, if you look at this is with storm surge, and that one is sea level rise only. There's no difference modeling wise because this is modeling a northeaster, and if you're familiar with Duxbury Bay, it's protected. This end of the bay is protected, and you actually don't get a storm surge coming up the bay in a true nor'easter. You would in a hurricane coming up from the south. You would get blasted here. But but one thing we are saying is that this roadway going out, which is the only roadway to get out to Powder Point area, is flooded pretty seriously. This is the Bluefish River Bridge looking up towards Snug Harbor area in Duxbury. And Washington, this is one of Duxbury's business areas. And again, this is with no storm. This is Washington Street here, and the Snug Harbor area, the Maritime School over here. And so now you add some storm surge, and it, you know, it does get dramatic, and with a with the flooding. Again, this is again we do experience flooding even now at times.
Gee,
Taking a break.
There we go. Taking a break.
All right,
What
let's
key
start.
did you hit?
I didn't do anything.
Startup disk is almost full. Yeah, I told you. Just say okay. Proceed.
Say you want to? I'm not familiar with your computer. Oh, we got it. Not sir. Just hit okay again.
Yeah. I don't see the, does anybody, I lost my cursor. Does anybody know how to get my cursor?
How about maybe reduce that?
Escape.
I can't do anything. It's nothing on the screen.
Oh, I just saw your cursor.
I just saw it down below her.
I saw
There
it.
it is.
Oh, but it's behind.
I don't know what to tell you guys. I'm at a loss here. I can escape and start over.
I guess. Yeah, try it.
Or Jimmy, you're too late.
Wait, yeah, just click OK.
Oh, there you go.
Now I can.
Well,
Well,
now you can.
I couldn't see it on the screen before. So what? So we were on that slide. We're good.
Yeah, anyway. Okay.
Good.
Sorry. Okay.
Do you want me to try to turn off the other light?
So this is Duxbury Beach, down at the Blakeman's area, the little pavilion area down. Where is it? This is the Powder Point Bridge coming across here. These are the parking lots. So when you get storm surge, there's a lot of water. And again, Duxbury is exhibiting a lot of flooding Duxbury Beach right now. And this is the pavilion now. There's a dune here. The beach reservation is actually trying to get some funding to actually raise the dunes as part of an adaptation, because we want to try and raise the dunes by 2 feet to provide some additional protection. So, okay, so that's sort of the drama part of it. The question then is, what are some of the impacts that we might be looking at? First of all, certainly tidal salt marsh throughout the area it can be impacted. Certainly, there are a whole bunch of them up and down the bays and rivers. Marshes are very important. Salt marsh is very important. It's a spawning ground, habitat for birds and all kinds of aquatic species. And there can be some very negative impacts. And there's actually, by the way, I think, I'm not sure which...
It's the March
the 5th one. I think it was the 5th session of this lecture series is going to be specifically talking about the impacts of sea level rise on salt marsh. So that is going to be a very important one to attend. But if the salt marsh grows, and if it cannot keep up with the sea level rise, you can lose your salt marsh and have some very negative impacts. So again, we did not go as part of this study into the details of it, but it's just something, potential impact. Certainly beaches up and down the coast. As tidal elevations increase, it certainly will affect the erosion process on the beach. As the wave energy intensifies, erosion will accelerate. And as Al can attest on Duxbury Beach, last year we spent about close to $1 million after Nemo and the 2 storms that we dealt with in fixing our sacrificial dune. The beach is a sacrificial dune. It's designed to fail and protect So it did exactly that, except it's failing a few too many times. We lost a section of dune again last week. So it's a never-ending process. It's getting worse, and it can be expected to get worse. Certainly wildlife. Piping plovers, endangered species. We have least terns, have all kinds of habitat species out there, endangered species. So dune erosion can affect them, certainly. If we lose, unfortunately, we lose probably most of our birds on Duxbury Beach due to storms. And they literally just the waves come up and wash out the nests, and they have to start nesting all over. And certainly any changes to the mudflats or tidal or salt marsh can also have negative impacts. Certainly shellfishing, again, there's a lot of prime shellfish area in the area, and both from a commercial and recreational. And that's another, I talked to some of the shellfish growers. The jury is out exactly how the impact will affect them. And, for instance, certainly if you have deeper water, you're going to have less time to actually physically work in the shallow areas. The deeper waters could alter patterns of predation and exposure. So it may be beneficial, may not be. Rising water temperatures can affect the shellfish growth patterns and potential for disease. And also nutrient levels could change. So the jury's out on what will be the impacts of rising sea levels. I did sort of joke that one of the benefits is maybe of rising sea levels is a little bit less dredging, because the water level rises. Dredging is always a big problem in these areas. So there's certainly a number of roadways. Roadways in all three towns, some very important ones. And I won't go into all the names, you can sort of see them, but Duxbury, there's a number, and in Scituate, there's a number of roads. And these are all major, some fairly major roads. Coastal stabilization structures. Now, what do I call it? Seawalls, revetments, jetties, groins, all of these things are man-made structures that are there to ostensibly to help protect the shoreline. Rising sea levels, it will actually be problematic, especially to things like hardscape seawalls. Part of the problem is that when you look at a seawall like this, we have many of our seawalls that have lost all the beach in front. And you literally, even at high tide practically, your tide is coming right up to the base of the seawall. As water level gets deeper, as wave energy will increase, because wave height is a direct function of water depth. It can, some physics involved. So the deeper the water, the bigger the waves. The bigger the waves, the more energy. And so just building seawalls higher is not necessarily the answer. Even if you might try and protect some home behind here, it's not necessarily a good solution on the long term. And part of that is because without coming with some good energy dissipation in front of that seawall, it actually can be very detrimental. So rising sea levels will certainly add to the controversy of seawalls. Again, so the deeper water depths result in the bigger waves. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. We're talking about this. Okay. All right. And again, as I was talking about Duxbury Beach in particular, Duxbury Beach is really, it's the barrier that protects the town of Duxbury, not only the mainland itself, but the Duxbury Bay, which is, we have a lot of oyster farming, recreational use. So it's a major area that is being impacted, and if we lose that beach, as has happened in Chatham and Edgartown, have had major beach breaches that change the entire area. So this is what we're trying to prevent. We also have we're trying to raise the the level of the roadway, because we have some dips in the roadways in the back beach area that are currently flooding on every astronomical high tide. So there are about 250 homes out at the Gurnet Point in Saquish that at astronomical high tides cannot access, so it becomes an emergency problem. And that's about 9,800, almost 2 miles of road. So it's a lot to look at. And this was a picture about a year ago. This was just a 12.3 high tide, astronomical high tide. No big waves, no storms, nothing. Two of our trustees were flying around. Already, I mean, there's flooding periodic. This is the Blakeman's parking lot. There's a bunch up here at High Pines and things. So we're even experiencing the flooding on a much more regular basis now. Underground infrastructure systems, again. Most of the underground systems that we have out there today, they're flooding today. So it's not a big, it's not a big change. And so we have mostly electric, most of the electric cable and telephone are all pole mounted, so theoretically they're relatively well protected. The rising sea levels may affect the deterioration rate of buried underground infrastructure. There's certainly more increased chances of road washouts and failure of the road structure, the road bed itself. And then, septic systems that are located near coastlines. For instance, Duxbury doesn't have, Marshfield and Scituate are fairly well sewered, or have a lot of sewage systems. Duxbury really doesn't. We have no sewer, very little sewer. And so, therefore, any septic systems that are in the close proximity of the water can be affected and cause either breakout or actually have them become code compliant. In terms of transportation facilities, the MBTA station, Greenbush station up in Scituate is fine, and Duxbury and Marshfield don't have any MBTA facilities. But if you think of the public school bus routes that are going to be in areas that will flood more and more, there may have to be some thoughts about rerouting some of the bus routes. Emergency access, as we talked about, these are 2 photos from last week in Scituate, and I think this was also in Scituate. More frequent roads that are closed today due to storms are going to flood more often. As I mentioned, there in Gurnet and Saquish, there are about 250 homes out there. And part of the issue there is, aside from the fact that it's inconvenient and possibly a health issue, safety issue if they can't get out, it is also part of the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant's evacuation plan. So right across, about as close as you can get, they're looking right at the power plant across the bay. And if they cannot get out of there, technically the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant doesn't have an operating safety plan. And the frequency is expected to increase.
Plus they're flooding too.
Plus. So, okay, so now as we talked about adaptation strategies. Adaptation, again, we did not focus on specific detailed recommendations, but we did talk, we sort of tried to look at 4 categories, of which one we didn't recommend anything, but do nothing. Do nothing. We didn't even consider that, although that very likely will be a used strategy. But you have 3 basic things that you can do. You can protect things. So seawalls, floodgates, hurricane barriers are sort of devices or strategies for protecting people. Accommodating would be you have a structure or a road or something, and you want to minimize the damage to it, so you can flood-proof it, you can raise it, so you can raise houses, buildings, and or you could, like Duxbury Beach is a sacrificial structure which will be there to help accommodate. And then the last and the most difficult is to retreat. And the question is certainly being raised more and more when we saw the effects of Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, effects of Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy. This discussion is becoming more and more relevant. and it's a very difficult one. People, have homes, businesses. You looked at Front Street or Brant Rock, their businesses, their livelihoods. So the idea of saying, well, we're just going to abandon this area, it's not an easy discussion, but there are ways to maybe approach it. So what we did for each town, we sort of came up with a little matrix, and this is just one page of them, but to address the impacted areas that we saw, we came up, and I know you can't read it, but it's basically the idea is that we tried to rate them, so as an example, this would be raised in Duxbury, this was raised sections of Washington Street in the Snug Harbor area on Bluefish River and Martecchini Court parking lot and associated underground utilities. So that is an accommodation type strategy. Raise the roads. If you have flooding roads, raise them. And certainly a lot of those are fairly doable. It gets much more difficult in a downtown area like a Front Street in Scituate, where you have businesses on both sides and their doors are, so unless the businesses get raised, you really can't raise the roadways. But then we also tried to look at, sort of evaluate relative cost, high, medium, low. So everything would be high, medium, low. So relative cost, regulatory constraints, how does it impacts the tax base? How does it, is it political impacts? Some of these things can be very political, and environmental. So we sort of tried to rate each of these various strategies. And some of them, this one doesn't have any of the retreats, but we had, for instance, investigate constructing offshore floating breakwater of some type. And they're now trying to develop some of these energy dissipation devices. Instead of making a hard structure breakwater, which we know would be politically impossible, I'm sure, and environmentally impossible, but maybe a floating type structure that could even be floated in advance of a storm. Things like that could be, and for instance at Logan Airport, we will be looking at some of these kind of strategies, literally balloon type structures that you can put around critical infrastructure to protect them from rising floods. So at least on the short term. So with that, and then the last piece of this was the education and outreach component. The towns felt very strongly. It happened to coincide with this whole FEMA fiasco with the flood insurance. It happened to coincide with that, and so we were getting confused. Our project is looking forward. The FEMA project is for today. So without considering any sea level rise impacts at all. So if you add the sea level rise to what they have, it's really pretty devastating. But we did meet with all of the select boards in town. We're meeting with legislators. We're still trying to work with all of our legislative delegations. And all of the full report is on all of the websites. Each of the 3 towns and their planning departments have a website that you can actually get you can read the whole report, and it has a lot more in the background there. So with that, we can have a little discussion, questions. About a half hour, so I'm a little late. Alex?
I had one question that came to mind while you were discussing it. I would assume that with the sea level rise, the tide range is going to change.
That's our assumption. Yeah, there probably will be some effects, but it's at this point we could not quantify that. So yeah, what we said was the tide range will just change, just move up or down. Well, up.
So most of the flats that are exposed to low tide now will no longer be exposed.
That's the impact potential. And however, what the reality is that the bay and a lot of the mud flats, they silt up. That's our problem. We're trying to keep passages passable for marine traffic. So as the natural silting action, occurs, it'll just keep moving.
Okay.
The question is how fast does it move relative to the tide? So,
Thank you.
So low tides are getting higher too, right?
well, that's right. So if whatever
So my-
we're assuming
my tide
that
is
the
low
sea
tide.
level, just the entire range moves.
So I had a question that I'm not sure how to answer. So our range of tide here is 9.5 or 10 feet. Range of tide in Buzzards Bay is 2 feet. And the range of tide in Bay of Fundy is 40 feet.
Right.
So are we going to maintain those relative ranges, or is that going to even out?
Yeah, well, that's our we didn't get into that kind of detail, so we're assuming. I would say
What do you think?
that because that's more sort of lunar, and I would say that's not going to change. So our relative tidal ranges, that's our assumption, that the relative tidal ranges, so where you have astronomical tides today at one elevation 12, they're going to go up to, but depending by those sea level rise amounts.
Is the fact that you're not including the effect of wave action, is that primarily a computational limitation currently?
Yeah, it's actually, we're starting to do that for the city. Woods Hole Group is working with us in the Cambridge area, and they're modeling the Boston Harbor region, so that'll be actually piggybacked with the Massport study, where they're trying to get a lot more detail there. But it's very expensive to model that. And when FEMA did their mapping, which they do take into account the waves, they tried to simplify, and this is somewhat of the controversy, they tried to simplify their modeling by using a modeling technique that was very well suited to the Pacific coast, which is basically a much straighter coastline, much more uniform slope, and so it was well suited for them. For us, where we have in and out and varying coasts and rocks, and it doesn't work as well. So the theory is that their modeling technique is actually, it's simpler for them to do, but it is supposedly is over, I mean, I don't want to say anything, but I believe it's over predicting what the effects are.
So I was interested in you talking about, I say subsidence, you were saying something like subsidence, substance. But also we have erosion. So we have all these different soil types in here, and one of the things that I've noticed here is that we're having, we're losing soil from underneath the asphalt. We're losing soil. And it seems to me that that's going to vary considerably depending on your soils. So everything sort of south of Duxbury is going to leave a lot faster than the clays and the rock and so on and so forth, right?
Oh yeah, certainly rock is pretty, it does not have as much, but the question of subsidence is, if you're looking at plate tectonics, if you look at it that way, it really, the little erosion that you have under your pavement is a structural failure. That has nothing to do with the overall land moving. Yeah, it's the plate tectonics is really the plate going up or down.
So you're talking about the Hudson going up and us going
exactly,
down.
Something.
That's the kind of thing.
Right.
But
So,
we also have this other phenomenon going on.
oh yeah, that's on a local level, yeah. I mean,
So how do we account for that?
if you have, for instance, an area, Back Bay, as an example in Boston, which was built in over basically the marsh. It was an area that was filled in over the marsh. That area is subsiding on its own. It's just compressing. The peat underneath just literally compresses. So that would have even more of an accelerate. If you look at a very localized area, we certainly couldn't look at that in this study. But if you really wanted to get into that, you could look and say that the area there is subsiding even more.
So what would you say that in terms of really understanding your local backyards? Know your soils,
Yeah, I think when you're looking at it from a sort of a planning perspective like this, you really don't need to talk, I think from a town's municipal perspective, you don't need to worry about that. You, as a homeowner or as a property owner or as a business owner, you do need to look at your specific issue. And if you know that your property is subsiding and you happen to be next to a river, then you would, as you're planning your building, you may want to build, let's say you might now do, well, today maybe at around elevation 11 is your flood elevation. If you were to, without the new FEMA stuff, you would build maybe a foot or two higher to take that into account. By the way, I don't know if you're familiar with Haddad's restaurant in Brant Rock. They built their new building. They have a beautiful new restaurant there. They built it based on the old flood maps. A base elevation that was elevation 11. They said, wow, we're going to build it 13 so that we have 2 feet of extra freeboard. The new flood maps that came from FEMA were at elevation 16. So just literally, they opened a year ago, and now they're faced with some astronomical. So yeah.
And that's going to affect the insurance.
Oh yeah,
Right.
yeah. It drives like something like $20,000-$30,000.
How about the flood maps for Pilgrim? How does this affect?
Well, we were just, Pine was just mentioning that. You're not the only one, yeah. I don't know, I really don't know how Pilgrim, what she was mentioning is a very interesting situation, is they're building the new dry cask storage at, what was you said, elevation 24.5.
Yeah.
So, now they're building 300-year life or something, whatever the number is. So, 300 years from now, I mean, this was 75 years, was 5 feet. Chances are they're going to be moving those dry casks sometime in the future.
Yeah, their existing flood velocity zone, as I was saying, is 17. The turbine is 22, and the dry cask is 25 and 24 and a half.
And keep in mind, they're only getting an extension of 20 years. So, on the relative scale of things, they may not be in business after that.
Different there
Exactly,
is
we'll be moving.
Yeah.
is that they're so close to the coast that even your study didn't include wave action. And,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
it's
Yeah.
a significant, there's a lot of power behind those waves.
Yeah. And certainly they're oriented in the main fetch of a nor'easter,
Perfectly
just
oriented.
absolutely perfect right down the barrel. So.
You were saying too, under the seawalls, the bigger the seawall, the more you're eroding the beach underneath it too,
Yeah,
right? So
a typical seawall, the way the physics work, it actually deflects a component of the wave down, and it
Pulls
tends
it
to erode the base of the wall faster. So unless you have some good energy dissipation in front of that wall, whether it's riprap, whether it's beach, whether different, but the idea is without that, it's a losing proposition. You will eventually have to build such massive walls that they're just not going to be cost effective. You won't be able to build them. And not to mention, if you're trying to protect property behind, then you have to build them high enough to really offer protection. And at that point, you start blocking the views. So,
windows in the wall, right?
yeah.